Well, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for that brief introduction. You hit on some salient points there. I remember when I was Chief Executive of the Conservative Party, I said to Ian Duncan Smith, if they get me, you will be next. That's the way they work, and that's what happened. Another unfortunate episode in the history of the Tory party. But today I don't want to talk too much about the Tory party. I want to talk about what's happening in Europe and how it's impacting us. Ladies and gentlemen, it's now some 50 years since Dean Acheson, the US Secretary of State, claimed that Britain had lost an empire and not found a role. You may remember at that time there was a satirical programme called That Was the Week That Was. And on that programme there was a sketch of Harold Macmillan, played of course by William Rushton, ringing Jack Kennedy in a state of blind panic. The sketch was pretty close to the truth. Macmillan, our last old Etonian Prime Minister but one, was ever anxious to do the bidding of the United States. That, he believed, was the lesson of Suez. Macmillan did indeed panic, and not for the first or last time in his life. And Britain applied to join the common market, a project for which there had been no great enthusiasm nationally or amongst officialdom. Hugh Gaitskell, the then leader of the Labour Party, rightly described this idea as the end of Britain as an independent state, the end of 1,000 years of history. Now, we know Macmillan failed in his endeavour, but in turn, Heath was determined that membership should be secured at any price. The then US Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, declared that he looked forward to the day when he only needed to make one telephone call to find out the attitude of his European allies. Now, as most of you know, Henry Kissinger still is alive today, and he can now make that one telephone call to Baroness Ashton and find out her magisterial views on world affairs. In the immediate post-war period, we rightly accepted that the days of the British Empire were over. But having got that decision right, we then embarked upon a disastrous policy of abandoning the very sovereignty of the United Kingdom. We began the process of merging ourselves into one of the most ill-conceived empires of the 20th century. Today we face the greatest crisis in Europe since the 1940s, and regrettably, neither our old Etonian Prime Minister nor the United States has got a clue what to do. Unfortunately, we can no longer look to the leader of the Labour Party to provide a coherent analysis, as virtually the whole of the British establishment now consider that support for the European Union is a prerequisite of respectable behaviour. Regrettably, the European Union itself is now beginning to challenge for the title of the evil empire. Unemployment in Spain now exceeds 23%, and on current policies can only increase further. These are levels that were pertaining in the United States during the Great Depression in the 1930s. On the current policies, demanded by the European Union, Spanish unemployment may rise to 30% within a couple of years. Meanwhile, Greece continues on its journey to become a third world country. As in the 1930s, economic misery leads to the rise of extremist parties. In Greece, the Conservative and Socialist parties only 18 months ago had the support of 70% of the electorate. That has now fallen to 35%, and the rest of the electorate are drifting towards hard left parties and extreme nationalists. In France, the National Front has become the most popular party amongst young people. Unemployment, poverty, and extremism is once again on the rise in Europe. The tragedy is that no one amongst the political and bureaucratic elite of Europe will accept the real cause of this deepening crisis is the very architecture of the European project itself. A currency union has been created which cannot be justified on the basis of economic convergence. The elite maintain that the crisis is due to fiscal laxity and can be cured by austerity. A new treaty has been agreed to deal with this fiscal crisis following the veto that never was. Austerity alone will drive up unemployment, create a larger budget deficit rather than a smaller, and increase the real burden of debt. Europe experienced all of these problems during the 1930s due to the gold standard. Yes, austerity is necessary, but the IMF in the past accepted that for recovery to be achieved, austerity needed to be accompanied by monetary easing and depreciation of the currency. That's what happened in this country in 1976 when the IMF had to come in and sort out our economic affairs. Now, Mr. Geithner, the US Secretary of State, may know this too. He used to work at the IMF, but he knows he cannot persuade the European elite that the Eurozone itself is flawed. And such advice would be contrary to the long-established policy of the US State Department. Last autumn, Mr. Geithner came to Europe and argued and advocated a big bazooka was the answer. Mr. Cameron liked that phrase, and he even went to Berlin and found out what the German for big bazooka was. Regrettably, the big bazooka idea also does not solve the problem. The idea can work as a way of restoring market confidence, especially when there has been a banking crisis, and the US did this to some effect post-Lehman. But it cannot restore market confidence when the problem that has caused the crisis has not been dealt with. And that is what we are facing here. Now, there is a third solution advocated by some of the European elite to this problem, and it is to introduce a system of substantial fiscal transfers between countries and to have a debt union. Now, the problem with this supposed solution is that there are very few strong economies in Europe that could afford such transfers. Some people thought the Netherlands was a strong economy. Well, we've learnt this week that it's not strong at all. Germany and Finland alone can probably be classified as strong at the present time. But those countries do not have enough resources to prop up all the weak economies. This is not the United States of America, where there are lots of economically strong states. In Europe, the weak would bring down the strong. The burden imposed upon Germany by a system of fiscal transfers would be greater than that required under the reparations system brought in by the Treaty of Versailles. And we all know where that ended. The real problem is that a currency union has been created in excess of that which can be justified by economic convergence. What we now have is a massive competitiveness crisis. Italy, for instance, is some 40% uncompetitive against Germany. The Monti government, not elected, but they're now in office, the Monti government is trying to introduce some labour market deregulation into Italy. But even if the measures that they introduced were extremely successful, they might just improve Italy's competitiveness by, say, 0.5% of 1% of GDP in a single year. The measures that they're bringing in can no way close that 40% gap. Now, ladies and gentlemen, in February 1996, it's now some 16 years ago, I warned the House of Commons of these risks and strongly argued that peripheral countries must not be allowed to join the Eurozone. At that time, the flawed Maastricht Treaty had been passed into British law. I argued that if a disaster was to be avoided, the UK government must veto the application of countries such as Italy to join the Eurozone. I argued that Britain was not an economic island and that an ill-constructed Eurozone would damage our national interest. Now, there were some Conservative MPs who claimed that they voted for Maastricht because they were confident it could not happen. Yeah, they did. It made me laugh. But a number of them that came up to me and said, well, if we thought what you were saying was actually going to happen, Barry, we'd join you, but we all know it's not going to happen. Incredible. But that was their line. I believe that whatever the practical problems of monetary union, it would happen, and that peripheral countries would be part of it. Now, why did I come to that conclusion? The economics are crazy, but I came to that conclusion because I met so many politicians here and abroad who were the so-called committed to the European project. I knew that their commitment to this project defied logic, and many of them profoundly disliked the idea of free markets. And today, we continually hear them railing against markets and blaming markets for our problems. So this is why I believe that we are nowhere near the end of this crisis. This project is being driven by a group of people who will continue to pursue their objectives with a disregard for economic reality and the well-being of the people of Europe. Many of the elite have invested their entire lives in this misconceived project. They are not going to change. The trail of economic, social and political destruction is underway, and has some years to run unless immediate action is taken. The collateral damage to the UK as a member of the European Union will be considerable. Many of the EU institutions will suffer considerable financial damage, and the UK will be required to contribute to their losses. I'll give you just one example today of how this problem is going to unravel and drag us in. And I'll give that example as being the European Investment Bank. Now, not many people know a lot about the European Investment Bank, but I'll give you some straight, simple facts. The European Investment Bank has capital of 10 billion euros. 10 billion euros. But it's lent 800 billion euros. It's what's known as a very highly geared bank. 80 times. The way that those people run the European Investment Bank makes a Fred Goodwin look like a very prudent banker. And what have they done with that 800 billion? Well, I've got a bit of bad news. I'm sorry about this. 35% of it has been lent to sovereigns, private companies, and public bodies in the peripheral area. The bad news, ladies and gentlemen, is that the UK owns 15% of the European Investment Bank. And George Osborne, our Chancellor, not many people know this, it's pretty quiet, didn't get pretty quiet, has agreed to contribute, if required, if requested, by the European Investment Bank, 35 billion euros. This is a very cavalier attitude to taxpayers' money and makes the 10 billion bung to the IMF look like small beer. Regrettably, again, a lot of people don't understand this, the UK is also a shareholder in the ECB, European Central Bank. And again, something that is not well known, we allow the European Central Bank, when it produces a consolidated balance sheet, to include all the reserves we have here in the Bank of England, to make that ECB balance sheet look as strong as it possibly can. The EU balance sheet, the ECB balance sheet, I said the European Investment Bank was 80 to 1, the ECB is 300 to 1. Now, I fear at some point in the coming years there will be a crisis regarding the European Central Bank. Now, when that happens, we will doubtless be told that it is in our national interest to support and contribute to the European Central Bank. So those are some of the very nasty problems that are coming down the road as we go deeper into this crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, it's now 23 years since a British Prime Minister set out an alternative strategy for Europe. The European elite did not listen to what was said. And since then, no British Prime Minister has dared to offer an alternative. Since 1988, more and more power has passed to the European Union. The House of Commons has become a shadow of its former self. It has a shorter working week, the so-called unsociable hours have been curtailed, and MPs have, frankly, obscenely long holidays. This has now become the established practice. Even when sitting, MPs are provided with workfare to keep them busy. Meetings on the committee corridor, which can decide nothing, and meaningless debates in Westminster Hall to allow parliamentary representatives to let off steam. In his budget, George Osborne announced a raft of new measures, absolute raft of new measures, but the reality was he tinkered. The total effect of all of his changes will be to add 0.1%, that's 0.1%, to our GDP by 2015. The economy is crying out for supply-side reform, but the reality is that that responsibility now rests with the European Union. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that the crisis that our country faces today will not be overcome until we restore self-government. Many of our leading economists now accept that we would be better off out of the European Union. If we stay, they will bleed us dry. If we stay, we will remain uncompetitive, excessively regulated, and will be deprived of the opportunity to enter into free trade agreements with the rest of the world, whose markets are growing rapidly, while those of continental Europe are shrinking. I began, ladies and gentlemen, by speaking of events some 50 years ago, and I will end by quoting from the words of Sir Winston Churchill to the House of Commons some 60 years ago, on the 11th of May, 1953. Churchill said, "We are with Europe, but not of it. We are linked, but not compromised. We are associated, but not absorbed. If Britain must choose between Europe and the open sea, she must always choose the open sea."